Hanger. I think most people know you, John, as recent secretary, past secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection, and some other folks probably know you as founding president of PennFuture. But what people may not know or remember as well is that you were a commissioner for the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission here in Pennsylvania in the 90s. So we wanted to sit down with you today and ask you a little bit about reflections on what recently happened in Texas with the rolling blackouts due to inadequate supply to meet demand. But before we get into that, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what happened here in Pennsylvania in 1994.
Sure. Well, you're right. Most folks probably don't remember, for a very good reason, that I was on the Public Utility Commission. It was quite a long time ago. And in my first year at the Commission, I got to work early in the morning and received a call on January 19th, 1994 from Jay Pfeiffer, who was then the president of electric utility called West Penn Power. West Penn Power had its Pennsylvania headquarters in Greensburg, Westmoreland County, and he called with some very dramatic news. He said that at that moment we were talking, and it was a little before 7 a.m., that he really didn't have enough power to meet the demand in his service territory. We were right in the middle of a brutal deep freeze. The temperatures had been around zero and then below zero, indeed down to -20. Wind chills were even worse than that. And the deep freeze had extended for a number of days. And he told me that the coal piles at the coal plants were freezing, and West Penn Power had used just about 100% coal to make electricity. And as a result, the coal plants either weren't working or were not working as at an optimum level. And he urged me to call Governor Casey to ask that the governor declare a statewide emergency. I, of course, picked up the phone after hanging up with Jay and called Jim Brown, who was the chief of staff to Governor Casey. And to make a pretty long story short, Jim told me that his wife had just called to say that the lights had gone out at his home. His home was in the PPL service territory. And at that point, I'm thinking, everything is hitting the fan. We've got major problems out there. That was the first I'd heard of problems within the PPL service territory. Jim Brown then agreed that a state of emergency was necessary, and Governor Casey, in fact, declared it. And the good news that came out of that was that the public responded overwhelmingly to the declaration and cut their consumption very quickly and very sharply. And in fact, what was called rolling blackouts was avoided in the West Penn Power Service territory and the rest of Western Pennsylvania. But rolling blackouts had already begun. In fact, had begun before Jay Pfeiffer and I had the conversation a little before 7 a.m. on the 19th of January in 1994. Those rolling blackouts were going through the entire PJM service territory, which extended from northern New Jersey down to northern Virginia. The federal government in Washington, D.C. closed. The state government in Pennsylvania closed. State government in New Jersey closed. It was a very, very serious situation because if the grid was lost when temperatures were -20, it could have really put people's lives at risk.
So reduced demand did help to delay what could have been a catastrophic, or
well, it prevented the reduced demand as a result of the declaration of emergency, prevented even temporary, these controlled so-called rolling blackouts from being necessary in the West Penn Power Service territory. But in the PJM service territory, these controlled rolling blackouts, where groups of customers lose service for typically 15, 20 minutes or so, and then service is restored, had begun and were needed. The communication, quite obviously, was far from optimal. The Public Utility Commission should have been advised well before those rolling blackouts became necessary. Perhaps if we'd had a state of emergency declared earlier, they could have, the rolling blackouts could have been avoided in the PJM service territory as well. We did a full investigation, and one of the focuses of that investigation by the Public Utility Commission was communication. I got to know the president of PJM very well. We started off not so well with this event, but over the years, PJM has done tremendous work, and the communication got a whole lot better, thankfully. At the root of the problem was that machines have a hard time running in really cold weather, and electric generation plants are machines, and the plant that kicked off and caused the rolling blackouts in PJM was a nuclear plant. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. A lot of other things had gone wrong up to that point. Again, the coal plants weren't running very well anywhere in the state. Natural gas plants were being interrupted because natural gas was needed for heating purposes at homes and hospitals and other places. We didn't make that much electricity from natural gas, but in a crisis, literally every megawatt counts. And then the Susquehanna nuclear facility had a mechanical breakdown, and these things happen. But at that point, there were no reserves left, and that's what then necessitated the rolling blackouts within the PJM service territory. It's ironic. One other thing I should mention: it was pretty cold. And it was pretty windy. But in 1994, Pennsylvania had no wind. We had virtually no renewables other than hydro, which of course was not really operating because the rivers were frozen. Sure. At least it was operating much less. So we had a system that was very dependent on coal and nuclear power in those days.
So were the factors that caused those rolling blackouts and the taxing of the grid here in Pennsylvania similar factors to what caused recent rolling blackouts in Texas?
There seems to be some real similarities, but also some differences. In Texas, there was 12,000 megawatts of plant that was out for maintenance on a planned basis. That's a lot of capacity out on a planned basis for the winter months. There's been disagreement in the media reports about whether that 12,000 megawatts being out of service was normal or not. Whether it was normal or not, it needs to be reviewed. If it was a normal practice, it might not be, in fact, a prudent practice. Normal practices aren't necessarily prudent practices. I have some real questions about that amount of capacity in Texas being out on a planned basis. So they had 12,000 megawatts. It's more or less in the shop, getting tuned up, and then things started going badly wrong because for Texas it was quite cold. It actually didn't get below zero. It got down to single digits, but it was cold for Texas. And 7,000 megawatts of gas and coal plants that were supposed to run on February 2nd to meet the morning peak didn't run. They broke down. There were problems at coal plants. Pipes were breaking. There was interruptions of gas service apparently to some of the gas plants because, believe it or not, Texas was running low on gas. I mean, Texas produces a third of the country's gas, but they were having to divert gas from making electricity and sending it to homes for heating fuel. Of course, when you interrupt a home for its electricity service, typically the gas furnace goes out. So these furnaces require electricity to run. So diverting gas from a power plant, if it means that the lights then go out, it doesn't necessarily help somebody at home to keep the heat on. So they had 12,000 megawatts in the shop, and then 7,000 megawatts broke down, so like a car on the side of the road, unexpected breakdown. And the combination of those two things combined with a much higher demand because of the very unusual cold weather meant they did not have enough supply to meet their peak demands. They started doing these controlled rolling blackouts. They were dropping customers in groups for quite a bit of time, actually. Apparently, some customers were knocked off the system for 4 times in about 9 hours. Some of the blackouts lasted as long as 45 minutes. So it sounds like it was a more serious shortage than we had here in PJM in 1994.
And so are there things that could be taken as successes from what happened in Texas. I know there was some actual good news. It doesn't sound that way, but there was some positive news that came out of that in terms of renewable energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Wind power is a significant provider of electricity in Texas, and wind energy was very important on February 2nd. In fact, the head of the Texas grid has given a special thanks to the wind industry and the wind generators because they provided the power that was expected at that time. Unlike the coal plants and unlike the natural gas plants, they provided what was expected. And he has said the blackouts would have been much worse except for the wind power that was being generated. It was windy in Texas, and there was it was obviously very needed power at a critical moment. And I think what that demonstrates is that electric systems are more reliable if they have more diverse sources of fuels. If you have a system that is all of one type of energy, or one type of plant, or too many eggs in a particular basket, you actually have a less reliable system than if you have a diverse system.
So does deregulation here in Pennsylvania relate to that somehow?
Well, that's a word I don't use, deregulation, because I think it actually conveys to the public a misunderstanding. We had monopolies in Pennsylvania that were fully regulated. Now we have competitive electric suppliers who must operate by competitive rules. We have replaced monopoly rules with competitive rules. And in both cases, there are actually regulators overseeing those rules. Just like in the competition that we're all familiar with, sports competition, there are referees, there are rules. Just because you have competition doesn't mean you don't have any rules. It's not anarchy.
That is a misnomer.
Yeah, and the word deregulation kind of conjures up a notion that there are no rules and there are no regulators. There are different rules, and the regulators have a different role and a different function. But in Pennsylvania, we have a competitive electric market with competitive rules and also regulators who enforce those rules. In Texas, there doesn't seem to be any indication that the competitive market had anything to do with the rolling blackouts. There needs to be an inquiry of all of this matter. Why were the coal plants broken down? Is it, in fact, prudent to have 12,000 megawatts out on a planned basis? Why did the gas plants get short on gas? What kind of policies ought to be in place? And there should be an inquiry to make sure that nobody was playing funny games with the market. Specifically, folks should check to make sure that plants really were broken down and not sort of faking it and withholding their power in order to drive up our price. Again, there's no indication whatsoever that was going on in Texas on February 2nd. In fact, here in Pennsylvania, when we had rolling blackouts, we didn't have any competitive markets or competitive rules. We had fully integrated monopolies, and we had rolling blackouts. We were unable to deal with that deep freeze at that point. What I've seen over the years is that generators actually run better with competitive rules and competitive incentives than they did under the old monopoly system. Under the old monopoly system, once a generator got his plant in rate base and it was in your electric bill, they got paid pretty much whether the plant ran or not. You didn't have to actually produce electricity to earn revenue. And not so surprisingly, given that rule, the plants didn't run as well as they do now. Plants today are run much more frequently than in 10, 15, 20 years ago. Nuclear plants run 95% of the time or more. When I was on the Public Utility Commission, a good nuclear plant was operating 75% of the time. Breakdowns of plants are much less frequent today. They've been cut basically in half compared to the breakdown rate 10, 15 years ago. So the incentive that you get from only being paid as a plant owner if your plant is running and making electricity is a strong incentive to operate, to make sure your plant is actually ready to produce. So I don't think there's anything to the concern that a competitive market could have contributed to what happened in Texas, but everything should be looked at.
Well, you said something interesting about a diversified energy market, and I've heard you say in the past there's not a perfect energy solution. So would a more diversified energy market, would it, we know wind was helpful here. Is there a role that other renewables could potentially play?
Absolutely. Natural gas from a landfill, methane from a landfill, digesters on farms, solar that often actually peaks at the same time or close to the same time that the system peaks during the summer. I should mention that these blackouts have occurred during the winter because of the particular problems of operating in the winter. It's true that we have more demand and the highest demand in the summer because demand follows cooling load more than it follows heating load. But the challenges of equipment running in cold weather is just greater than equipment running in hot weather. There are challenges associated with hot weather too, but they're more difficult in cold weather. Diversity is the key word, and one way of getting diversity is having bigger service territories. And PJM has more than doubled since 1994 in its geographic size. And that helps to diversify. In addition to getting, today we get thousands of megawatts of wind energy in PJM. We got a lot of renewable energy coming into the system, and that's helping to diversify. But just the bigger geographic size is very important. Today PJM runs from northern New Jersey all the way into North Carolina, Kentucky, and then all the way to Chicago and Illinois to the west. It's the largest wholesale electric market in the entire world. And the bigger geographic area means that it's just more unlikely that very extreme weather will hit the entire geography. And it's very extreme weather, whether it's cold or heat, that really challenges the reliability of an electric system most frequently. So the bigger geographic area of PJM is a real strength. And in the case of Texas, they're hardly even connected to the U.S. grid. They've deliberately chosen to pretty well isolate themselves. And that means that it's very difficult to send power into Texas because it's just, you can't even export into Texas, or Texas can't import power. When PJM has a problem, they can now import power from Canada or other parts of the U.S. We're very interconnected, and that is another form of reliability and another form of diversity of supply. In Texas, because they're so isolated, literally haven't really joined the electrical union. When they got into trouble, those of us in the rest of the country couldn't really do much to help them.
Do you expect that to be part of the inquiry into what happened?
Well, it should be. Texas has its own, I guess, culture and its own preferences. Probably actually only Texas can decide to join the national grid in a serious way. If I were a business doing business in Texas, I would want the grid connected with the national grid. If I were a homeowner in Texas, I'd want my home connected to the national grid. So I think there's a lot of good reasons for Texas to do that, but they have their own ways down in Texas. So I'm probably actually not betting that they will.
Sure. Anything else you'd like to add today?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.